There comes a moment in life when you realize the people you loved most are capable of unthinkable cruelty. For 72-year-old Noreen Paskell, that moment came when her own son drove away and left her alone in the wilderness to die. With nothing but her walking stick and fading daylight, she pushed deeper into the forest, refusing to give up. 3 miles in, she found a cabin. Inside was a woman with a rifle and eyes that held secrets. What started as a plea for help became something far more complicated when the woman spoke her name, a name she shouldn't have known. 2 abandoned women, 1 hidden cabin, and a past that refused to stay buried. What happens when survival means facing the truth you've been running from your whole life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started with a knock on Noreen Paskell's apartment door at 7:30. Earlier than Derek usually showed up for anything. She'd been awake since 5, as was her habit these days, sitting in her recliner with lukewarm coffee and watching the local news cycle through the same stories it had covered the night before. Sleep didn't come easy anymore, hadn't for years, and the quiet hours before dawn felt like borrowed time she wasn't quite sure she deserved. When she opened the door, Derek stood there in his crisp, business-casual attire, a forced smile on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was 47 now, carrying the same lean build his father had possessed, the same narrow shoulders and carefully combed hair. Looking at him, sometimes hurt in ways Noreen couldn't quite articulate. "Morning, Mom," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Thought we could spend the day together, maybe get out of the city for a while." Noreen had blinked in surprise. Derek's visits had become increasingly rare over the past 2 years, especially since his wife Stephanie had filed for separation. When he did come by, it was usually for something practical, signing papers, discussing bills, making sure she hadn't fallen and broken a hip. The idea of him suggesting quality time together felt off, like a word spoken in the wrong context. "Out of the city?" she'd asked, setting down her coffee mug on the small table beside her chair. "Where were you thinking?" "I was thinking the National Forest. You always used to talk about how much you loved hiking when you were younger. Thought maybe we could take a drive up there, walk one of the easy trails. Beautiful day for it." It was true that Noreen had once enjoyed hiking, back when Gordon was alive and her knees didn't ache with every step. They'd taken trips to various state parks, walked hand in hand through autumn leaves and spring wildflowers. But that had been another lifetime before the arthritis set in, before the small strokes that left her right hand slightly weaker than it used to be. "I don't know if I'm up for much hiking anymore, Derek. My doctor said just an easy trail, Mom, mostly flat. I'll be right there with you." His smile widened, and something in his eyes made her chest tighten. "Come on, when's the last time we did something together? Just you and me?" She couldn't remember. Maybe that was answer enough. So she'd agreed, because what else did she have to do on a Thursday morning? She changed into her practical shoes, the ones with good treads, and grabbed a light jacket. Derek had waited by the door, checking his phone repeatedly, his jaw tight in a way that suggested impatience barely held in check. The drive north took almost 2 hours. Derek said very little, responding to her attempts at conversation with one-word answers or distracted hums. The radio played classic rock, songs from the 70s and 80s that reminded Noreen of her youth, of summers that seemed to last forever, and choices that felt inconsequential at the time. When they finally pulled off the highway onto a narrow Forest Service road, Noreen felt the first real stirring of unease. The road wasn't paved, just packed dirt and gravel that made Derek's sedan bounce and rattle. Pine trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the morning sun. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, gripping the door handle as they hit a particularly deep pothole. "A GPS says so," Derek replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They drove another 10 minutes before he pulled into a small clearing, barely large enough to turn around in. There was no trailhead marker, no informational sign, nothing to indicate this was an official hiking spot. Derek turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. Then he took a deep breath and opened his door. This is it. Come on! Noreen climbed out slowly, her joints protesting after the long drive. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance she could hear water running over stones. It was beautiful in a remote, untouched way, but the isolation made her skin prickle. Derek opened the trunk and pulled out her walking stick, the ashwood cane with Gordon's initials carved into the handle. He'd brought it from her apartment without asking, which meant he'd planned this, thought it through. That realization settled in her stomach like a stone. Here, he said, handing it to her along with a half-empty plastic water bottle. Trail starts just over there. He pointed toward a gap in the trees that might have been a path, or might have been nothing more than a game trail. Noreen squinted at it, then looked back at her son. You're coming with me, right? Of course. I just need to make a quick call for work. Signal's terrible out here. I'll catch up with you in a few minutes. Just follow the path, it's easy. Every instinct told her not to go, to insist they stay together, to demand they turn around and go back to the city. But Derek was already pulling out his phone, turning away from her, and she felt foolish for her fear. This was her son. He'd driven all this way to spend time with her. The least she could do was trust him. So Noreen started walking. The path, such as it was, wound through dense underbrush and over exposed roots that threatened to trip her with every step. She used the walking stick to steady herself, planting it carefully before shifting her weight. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional bird call and the whisper of wind through the high branches. She walked for what felt like 20 minutes, pausing frequently to catch her breath and look back the way she'd come. Derek never appeared. The clearing where he'd parked had long since disappeared from view, swallowed by the endless repetition of trees and shadows. Derek? She called out, her voice thin in the vast silence. Derek, where are you? No answer came. Noreen turned around, intending to walk back to the car, but the path behind her looked different now, or maybe she'd taken a wrong turn somewhere without realizing it. Panic began to rise in her chest, tightening her throat. She called for Derek again, louder this time, her voice cracking with the effort. Still nothing. She stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, trying to think clearly through the fog of fear. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out with shaking hands and looked at the screen. No signal, not even one bar. That's when she heard it. The distant sound of an engine starting, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel growing fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely. Derek had left. Her own son had driven away and left her here, alone in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help and no clear path back to civilization. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She sank down onto a fallen log, the walking stick clutched in both hands, and tried to understand what had just happened. This couldn't be real. Derek wouldn't do this. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd just gone to find better cell reception. Maybe he'd be back any minute. But even as she told herself these things, she knew they weren't true. She'd seen something in his eyes this morning, something cold and decided. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was intentional. Derek had brought her here to die. The sun had moved higher in the sky by the time Noreen finally stood up again. Her legs felt unsteady, and her heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to think practically. She could sit here and wait for someone to find her, or she could try to save herself. The first option would almost certainly end with her death. This clearly wasn't a popular hiking area, and she had no idea how far she was from the nearest road or ranger station. So she started walking, not back toward where Derek had parked, but forward, deeper into the forest, because forward was the only direction that felt like a choice rather than a surrender. The terrain grew rougher as she went. Her water was gone within the first hour, and her legs burned with exertion. She fell twice, scraping her palms on rocks and roots, but each time she pulled herself back up, using the walking stick, and kept going. The alternative, giving up, lying down, letting the forest take her, was unacceptable. She'd survived 72 years on this earth, raised a son, buried a husband, endured loneliness and loss, and the slow erosion of everything she'd built. She would not let it end like this. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon when she smelled smoke. At first, she thought she was imagining it, that her oxygen-deprived brain was playing tricks on her. But no, there it was again, faint but unmistakable. Wood smoke, the kind that came from a fireplace or wood stove. Noreen changed direction, following the scent like a lifeline. Her pace quickened despite her. Exhaustion, hope giving her strength she didn't know she still possessed. Someone was out here, someone who might have a phone or a vehicle, or at the very least could point her toward help. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a fever dream. It was small and weathered, built from logs that had gone grey with age. The roof sagged in the middle, and moss grew thick on the northern side. A thin stream of smoke rose from a metal chimney pipe. Noreen approached slowly, suddenly aware of how she must look, dirty, disheveled, desperate. She climbed the 3 wooden steps to the narrow porch and raised her hand to knock. Before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung open. The woman standing in the doorway was tall and lean, her body carrying the kind of hard muscle that came from physical labor rather than gym workouts. She looked to be in her late 40s, with shoulder-length hair gone mostly grey, and eyes that assessed Noreen with the cold calculation of a predator evaluating prey. In her hands, held with easy confidence, was a rifle. "Please," Noreen said, her voice cracking. "I need help. My son, he left me out here. I've been walking for hours and I don't know where I am and—" "Noreen Paskell," the woman said, her voice flat and emotionless. "I wondered if you'd ever find your way here." Noreen's words died in her throat. She stared at the woman, trying to understand how a complete stranger in the middle of nowhere could possibly know her name. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper. The woman's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Come inside. We have a lot to talk about." She stepped back from the doorway, the rifle still pointed casually in Noreen's direction, and waited. Noreen looked behind her at the darkening forest, then back at the woman with the gun. She thought about Derek's cold eyes and the sound of his car driving away. She thought about dying alone under the stars, her body never found. Then she stepped across the threshold into the cabin. The interior of the cabin was spare and meticulously organized in a way that spoke of military discipline or long-practiced survival. A wood stove dominated one corner, its iron surface radiating heat. Against the far wall stood a narrow cot with a wool blanket folded at precise right angles. Shelves lined with canned goods, mason jars of preserved vegetables, and neatly labeled containers occupied the space beside a small table and 2 mismatched chairs. Everything had its place, and nothing was wasted. The woman closed the door behind them and finally lowered the rifle, though she kept it within easy reach as she crossed to a water jug and poured a cup. She handed it to Noreen without a word. Noreen drank gratefully, the cool water soothing her parched throat. When the cup was empty, she set it down on the table with shaking hands and looked at the woman again. "How do you know my name?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the mantel above the wood stove and picked up something small, a photograph in a simple wooden frame. She studied it for a moment, then handed it to Noreen. The photograph was faded and creased, the colors washed out by time. It showed 3 young women standing on a dock, a lake stretching out behind them. They wore shorts and camp counselor t-shirts, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera with the careless confidence of youth. Noreen recognized herself immediately, even though more than 50 years separated her from that girl. She was on the left, barely 20 years old, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her breath caught as she studied the other 2 faces. The girl in the middle was beautiful, with golden hair and a radiant smile, Julie Kern. And on the right, younger than the other 2, with serious eyes and an uncertain smile, was the girl who would disappear that summer. "Camp Whispering Pines," Noreen whispered. 1972. "So you do remember." The woman took the photograph back and returned it to the mantel with careful precision. "I wasn't sure. People have a way of forgetting things that are inconvenient. Noreen's mind was racing, trying to place the woman standing before her with that serious-eyed teenager from half a century ago. The bone structure was similar, the way she held herself, but time and hard living had transformed her into someone almost unrecognizable. "Tamsin," she said finally. "Tamsin Ray." "That's right." Tamsin moved to one of the chairs and sat, gesturing for Noreen to take the other. The rifle rested across her lap, a constant reminder of the power dynamic between them. "The girl who ran away." The girl everyone blamed. "I don't understand," Noreen said, though part of her was beginning to. Memories were stirring, rising like sediment disturbed at the bottom of a dark lake. "What are you doing out here? Why would I know your name? Why would I have that photograph?" Tamsin leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Noreen's face. "Because I've spent 50 years trying to understand what happened that night. 50 years piecing together the truth while living like a ghost, always moving, never staying anywhere long enough for the past to catch up with me. Until I came here, until I decided it was time to stop running." Noreen's hands were trembling again. She folded them in her lap, pressing them tight together. "Tamsin, I haven't thought about that summer in— Don't lie to me." The words were sharp, cutting through Noreen's excuse like a blade. "You've thought about it. Maybe not every day, but it's been there, hasn't it? In the quiet moments, in the dreams you can't quite remember when you wake up. Julie Kern didn't just drown in an accident, and you know it." The name fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward that couldn't be called back. Julie. Beautiful. Laughing Julie, who had been so full of life that summer. Until she wasn't. "It was an accident," Noreen heard herself say, the words automatic, a script she'd been repeating for decades. "She went swimming after the bonfire. She'd been drinking. Tamsin reached into her shirt pocket and pulled out something small. She set it on the table between them, and Noreen's breath caught in her throat. It was a bracelet, the kind teenage girls made at summer camp from colorful beads threaded on elastic string. The beads spelled out a name, Julie, but what made Noreen's stomach clench was the dark staining on the string, the way some of the beads had cracked and discolored. Lake water and time had damaged it, but it had survived, preserved by someone who couldn't let go. "I found this the next morning," Tamsin said quietly, "on the dock where they said she went in. But Julie wasn't wearing it that night. I know, because I'd made it for her, and she'd taken it off earlier in the day. It was in our cabin, in her trunk. Someone put it there, someone who wanted to make it look like she'd been at the dock." Noreen couldn't take her eyes off the bracelet. Her mind was pulling her backward, dragging her into memories she'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. The bonfire, the smell of burning pine and cheap beer, Julie arguing with someone, her voice rising above the crackle of flames. Noreen had been drunk, they all had been, counselors sneaking alcohol after the campers were asleep, and everything about that night had a dreamlike, disconnected quality. "You saw who pushed her," Tamsin said, and it wasn't a question. "You were there. You saw what happened, and you said nothing." "I don't know what I saw," Noreen whispered, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "It was dark. I was drunk. You thought it was safer to stay quiet." Tamsin's voice held no judgment, only a flat statement of fact. "You were 20 years old, about to start your senior year of college. You had your whole life ahead of you, and Julie was already dead, and nothing you said could bring her back. So you convinced yourself it was an accident, and when they came looking for someone to blame, when they decided I must have done it because Julie and I had argued that afternoon, you still said nothing." The memories were coming faster now, each one sharp and painful. The police interviews, the way the camp directors had closed ranks, wanting the whole thing resolved quickly before parents started pulling their children out. The way everyone had looked at Tamsin, the youngest counselor, the one who didn't quite fit in, the convenient scapegoat. "They were going to arrest me," Tamsin continued. "Did you know that? Julie's family was wealthy. They wanted justice, or what they thought was justice. The police had my argument with Julie. They had witnesses who said I was jealous of her. She stopped, took a breath. They had enough to destroy my life, so I ran. I was 16 years old, and I ran into the woods and I never stopped running. Until now. Noreen felt tears on her cheeks and realized she was crying. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. "Tamsin, I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I was scared and selfish, and I convinced myself it didn't matter what I'd seen because you wanted to survive," Tamsin finished. "I understand that. Believe me, I understand survival. But I need you to tell me something, Noreen. I need you to remember that night, really remember it, and tell me what you saw. Because Julie deserves the truth. Her family deserves the truth. And whoever pushed her into that lake deserves to be held accountable, even if it's 50 years too late." Noreen closed her eyes, no longer fighting the memories. She let herself fall back into that night, into the heat of the bonfire and the taste of beer and the sound of Julie's voice cutting through the darkness. "It was a man," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet Tamsin's gaze. "I saw someone in a counselor's jacket. I saw him grab Julie's arm. I saw her pull away. And then," her voice broke. "Then there was a splash, and she screamed, but it was cut off so fast. Like someone was holding her under," Tamsin finished. Her hands were gripping the rifle so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Did you see his face?" Noreen shook her head miserably. "It was too dark, but I heard his voice just for a second. He said something to her before it happened. I've never been able to remember the words, but you'd recognize the voice if you heard it again. I don't know, maybe. It's been so long." Tamsin stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening forest. "Your son left you out here to die," she said. "Why would he do that?" The question hit Noreen like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the past that she'd almost forgotten the present horror of her situation. "I don't know," she admitted. "We haven't been close lately, but I never thought, has he been asking about your will, your finances?" Noreen thought about the papers Derek had brought her to sign over the past year, the way he talked about simplifying her affairs and making sure everything was in order. At the time, she'd thought he was being responsible. Now a darker possibility emerged. "Yes," she said quietly, "but surely he wouldn't abandon his elderly mother in the wilderness for money." Tamsin turned back to face her. "People have done worse for less, but that's not the only question, is it? The question is, why here? Why bring you to this specific forest, so close to where it all happened?" A chill ran down Noreen's spine. "You think he knows? About that summer? About Julie?" "I think," Tamsin said slowly, "that we're not the only ones who've been carrying secrets all these years." Night had fully fallen by the time Tamsin allowed Noreen to rest. She'd given her a thin blanket and pointed to a corner of the cabin where Noreen could lie down, though sleep seemed impossible. The wood stove radiated warmth, and outside the wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan like old bones settling. Tamsin sat in one of the chairs, the rifle still within reach, her eyes half closed but alert. Noreen understood she was being watched, guarded, though whether for her own protection or to keep her from leaving, she couldn't say. "You said you wondered if I'd find my way here," Noreen said into the darkness. "What did you mean by that?" Tamsin was quiet for so long that Noreen thought she might not answer. "Then this cabin is 15 miles from where Camp Whispering Pines used to be. I chose this location deliberately. I've been here for 3 years waiting. Waiting for what? For someone to tell the truth. For the right moment. For justice." Tamsin shifted in her chair, and firelight caught the sharp angles of her face. "I've spent my whole life running, Noreen. Sleeping in abandoned buildings, hitchhiking across state lines, taking jobs under fake names, and moving on before anyone could ask questions. I learned to hunt, to fish, to survive in places most people wouldn't last a week. And all that time I thought about that night, about Julie going under the water and never coming back up, about everyone deciding I was the monster. Why didn't you go to the police? Tell them what really happened? With what evidence? My word against everyone else's? I was 16, scared, and already being hunted. By the time I might have come forward, the case was closed. Julie's death was ruled an accidental drowning, complicated by alcohol consumption. The camp shut down the next summer. Everyone moved on with their lives. Tamsin's voice held a bitterness that decades hadn't softened. Everyone except me. And Julie, of course. She didn't get to move on at all. Noreen pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The memory of that night was clearer now, sharpened by Tamsin's presence and the weight of all those years of silence. She remembered Julie's face in the firelight, flushed and animated as she argued with someone just beyond the circle of light. She remembered the anger in Julie's voice, the fear underneath it. She was pregnant, Noreen said suddenly, the memory surfacing like something breaking through ice. I'd forgotten, but she told me. Earlier that day, she pulled me aside and told me she was pregnant. She was scared. Tamsin went very still. Did she say who the father was? No, but she said he was older. Someone with authority at the camp. She said he wanted her to. Noreen stopped, the rest of the memory solidifying. He wanted her to get rid of it, offered to pay for it. But Julie said she was going to tell everyone that she didn't care what it cost him. That's motive, Tamsin said quietly. That's why someone would kill her. The word hung in the air between them. Murder, not an accident, not a tragic mistake, but a deliberate act of violence to silence someone who threatened exposure. Noreen's hands found the walking stick that lay beside her, her fingers tracing the carved initials at the top. G.P. Gordon Paskell, her husband of 40 years, dead now for 5. The man who had comforted her after Julie's death, who had stayed in touch through letters during her final year of college, who had courted her with patience and gentleness until she'd agreed to marry him. Gordon was a counselor that summer, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was 25, one of the senior staff. Tamsin leaned forward. Did Julie know him? Everyone knew Gordon. He was popular with the other counselors. He organized the activities, led the hiking trips. He was... Noreen stopped, something cold settling in her stomach. He was the one who found your bracelet, the one you said was planted by the dock. He brought it to the police, said it proved you'd been there. The silence that followed was profound. Outside, an owl called, and something small scurried through the underbrush near the cabin. He was the one who told me not to worry, Noreen continued, the memories cascading now like water breaking through a dam. After Julie died, when the police were interviewing everyone, Gordon found me. I was upset, confused about what I'd seen. He told me it had clearly been an accident, that I shouldn't trouble myself with half-remembered images from a traumatic night. He said I'd been drinking, that my memory couldn't be trusted, that the best thing I could do for Julie was to let her rest in peace. He convinced you to stay quiet. He convinced me I hadn't seen anything worth reporting. Noreen felt tears on her face again. And then he stayed in my life, wrote to me that whole next year, showed up at my college graduation, asked me to marry him 2 years later. I thought he loved me. I thought we'd built something real together. Tamsin stood and moved to the small shelf where she kept her supplies. She pulled out a metal tin and opened it, revealing a stack of papers and photographs, all protected in plastic sleeves. She brought the tin to Noreen and sat down beside her. I've been investigating this for years, she said, spreading some of the papers out. Every time I settled somewhere for a few months, I'd go to libraries, search old newspaper archives, track down people who were at the camp that summer. Most wouldn't talk to me. Some didn't remember. But I found things. Small things, pieces of a puzzle I've been trying to put together. She pulled out a photograph, a group shot of the counselors from that summer. Gordon stood in the back row, tall and confident, his smile easy. Julie was in the front, her beauty evident even in the faded photograph. And there, on the edge of the group, almost like she'd been trying to stay out of frame, was young Tamsin. I found old camp rosters, staff evaluations, even some personal letters that Julie's sister gave me. Tamsin continued. Julie kept a diary, but it was never found after she died. Her sister always wondered what happened to it. I think whoever killed Julie took it because it had evidence in it, maybe his name, maybe details about their relationship. Noreen stared at the photograph, at Gordon's face. Had she ever really known him? In 40 years of marriage, had she ever truly seen the man behind the careful facade? There's something else, Tamsin said, her voice gentler now. Your son Derek. I need to know why he brought you here. Because this isn't random, Noreen. The timing, the location, it's too specific to be coincidence. I don't know, Noreen admitted. We haven't been close since his father died. He visits occasionally, usually when he needs something. But this morning, he just showed up and suggested we spend the day together. It seemed... She stopped, remembering Derek's forced smile, the tension in his shoulders, the way he'd avoided her eyes. It seemed wrong from the start, but I didn't want to believe my own son would hurt me. Has he been going through your husband's things? His papers, his belongings? Noreen thought about the months after Gordon's death, the way Derek had taken charge of settling the estate. He'd been efficient, organized, insisting that Noreen didn't need to trouble herself with the details. He'd boxed up Gordon's office, taken care of the legal documents, handled everything. He settled the estate, she said. Took care of all of Gordon's papers and personal effects. He said it was too hard for me to deal with so soon after the loss. I was grateful at the time. Tamsin's expression darkened. What if he found something? Something that connected Gordon to Julie's death? What if that's why he brought you here, to bury you and the secret with you? The thought was so horrifying that Noreen couldn't immediately respond. Her own son, protecting his father's murderous legacy by committing another murder. It couldn't be true. It was too monstrous. But then she thought of Derek's. Cold eyes this morning, the calculated way he'd handed her the walking stick, the sound of his car driving away without hesitation. And she knew that Tamsin might be right. What do we do? She asked. Tamsin began gathering up the papers, returning them carefully to the tin. We figure out what Derek knows, and why he's willing to kill to keep it quiet. And then we finish what should have been finished 50 years ago. We find out the truth about what happened to Julie Kern, and we make sure everyone knows it. Even if the truth is that I married her killer. Tamsin met her eyes, and for the first time there was something like compassion in her gaze. Especially then, because you were a victim too, Noreen. You just didn't know it. Noreen barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Gordon's face, not as he'd been in his final years, weakened by illness, but as he'd been that summer at Camp Whispering Pines. Young, strong, confident. She'd thought those qualities made him a good man. Now she wondered if they'd simply made him a more effective predator. When dawn finally broke, grey light filtering through the cabin's small windows, Tamsin was already awake. She'd made coffee on the wood stove, strong and bitter, and she handed Noreen a tin cup without comment. "Tell me about your marriage," Tamsin said, settling back into her chair. The rifle was propped against the wall now, still within reach, but no longer held like an immediate threat. Did Gordon ever talk about that summer? Noreen wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to hold on to. Not really. When we first started dating, he mentioned he'd worked at the camp where we met, but he never wanted to discuss it in detail. He said it brought back sad memories of the girl who drowned. I thought he was just being sensitive, or he was making sure you never asked too many questions. The words stung because they rang true. Looking back now with clear eyes, Noreen could see how Gordon had carefully steered conversations away from certain topics. How he'd deflected when she occasionally wondered aloud about Julie. How he'd made her feel foolish for dwelling on the past. He was good at that, she said quietly. Making me feel like my thoughts and feelings were silly or overblown. Not in a cruel way. He was never cruel. But he had a way of gently dismissing things until I stopped bringing them up. I thought he was just practical, helping me not to overthink everything. It's called gaslighting, Tamsin said, making you doubt your own perceptions. It's how abusers maintain control. Gordon wasn't. Noreen started to object, then stopped. Wasn't what? Wasn't an abuser. He'd convinced her to bury what she'd seen. He'd isolated her from the truth for 40 years. He'd married her possibly to keep her close, to ensure she never remembered too much or spoke too freely. What was that if not a form of abuse? She touched the wedding ring that still circled her finger, loose now on her thinner hand. She'd never taken it off, not even after Gordon's death. It had become part of her, a symbol of the life she'd built, the identity she'd claimed as wife and mother. Now it felt like a shackle. He had nightmares sometimes, she heard herself say. In the early years of our marriage, he'd wake up thrashing, calling out. Once I asked him what he'd been dreaming about, and he said it was war flashbacks. He'd served in Vietnam. But now I wonder if it was something else. If it was Julie coming back to haunt him. Tamsin stood and moved to the window, looking out at the forest. Did Derek know? About the camp, about Julie? I don't know. Gordon didn't talk much about his past, not even to Derek. He always said it was important to live in the present, not get stuck in what came before. Noreen paused, remembering. But after Gordon died, Derek seemed driven. He went through everything so quickly, so thoroughly. At the time, I thought he was just being efficient. Now I wonder if he was looking for something specific, like evidence his father had killed someone. The bluntness of it made Noreen flinch, but she didn't deny it. Maybe, or maybe he already knew. Maybe Gordon told him something before he died. Gordon was sick for months before the end. Lung cancer. He had a lot of time to think about his life, about his regrets. Deathbed confessions, Tamsin said. People want to unburden themselves before they go. What if Gordon told Derek what really happened that night? And what if Derek decided to protect his father's reputation and his inheritance by making sure no one else ever found out? Noreen set down her coffee cup, her hands shaking too badly to hold it steady. But why bring me here? Why not just... She couldn't finish the sentence. Because it had to look like an accident or natural causes, Tamsin finished for her. An elderly woman with health problems goes missing on a hike, succumbs to the elements. Tragic, but believable. Much cleaner than a murder in the city that would trigger an investigation. And bringing you here, to the same forest where his father killed someone decades ago. Maybe that's poetic justice in his twisted mind. Or maybe he just knows the area, knows it's remote enough that a body might never be found. The horror of it settled over Noreen like a heavy blanket. Derek had planned this. He'd thought it through, considered the angles, decided his mother's life was worth less than whatever secret he was protecting. She'd raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him, and he'd repaid her with calculated murder. "I can't stay here," she said suddenly, standing up despite the weakness in her legs. "I need to get back, go to the police, tell them what Derek did." "How?" Tamsin asked, her voice not unkind. "You don't know where you are. You have no phone signal. You could barely make it 3 miles through the forest yesterday, and you want to hike 15 miles to the nearest road. You wouldn't make it, Noreen. And even if you did, Derek has a head start. He's probably already reported you missing, playing the concerned son whose mother wandered off and got lost. By the time you showed up with accusations about a 50-year-old murder, who would believe you?" The truth of it was crushing. Noreen sank back down, feeling the full weight of her helplessness. She was 72 years old, abandoned in the wilderness, with nothing but the word of another outcast to support her story. Even if she survived, even if she made it back to civilization, she had no proof of anything. Just memories and accusations, and a terrible growing certainty that everything she'd believed about her life had been a lie. "So what do I do?" she asked, hating the defeat in her own voice. Tamsin turned from the window and looked at her for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was firm. "You stop running. You stop hiding from what you know to be true. You've been doing that for 50 years, and look where it's gotten you. Abandoned by your own son, married to a murderer, your whole life built on a foundation of silence and fear. It's time to stand still and face it. I'm not like you," Noreen protested. "I'm not strong. I'm not a survivor. You walked 3 miles through unfamiliar terrain yesterday with nothing but a stick and a half bottle of water. You didn't give up even when you knew your son had left you to die. You kept moving, kept fighting. Don't tell me you're not a survivor." Tamsin crossed to where Noreen sat and crouched down to meet her eyes. "What happened to Julie was your fault in part. You stayed silent when you should have spoken. What happened to me was your fault in part. I lost everything because no one would tell the truth. But what happens next? That's up to you. You can die here feeling sorry for yourself, or you can help me finish this. Help me give Julie justice. Help me clear my name. Help us both stop being victims." Noreen looked into Tamsin's weathered face and saw something she hadn't noticed before. Not anger or accusation, but hope. This woman, who'd survived 5 decades in the wilderness, alone and hunted, still believed that truth mattered, still believed that justice was worth fighting for. Slowly, Noreen nodded. "Tell me what I need to do." Over the next 2 days, Tamsin shared the full scope of her investigation. The cabin's sparse furnishings hid a surprising amount of documentation: file folders tucked under the floorboards, newspaper clippings preserved in sealed bags, and most remarkable of all, a hand-drawn map of the surrounding area marked with meticulous detail. "I've been watching these woods for 3 years, Tamsin explained, spreading the map across the small table. "Every trail, every access road, every cabin within a 20-mile radius. I know who uses them and when. I know where the ranger patrols go and where they don't. I know every way in and every way out." Noreen studied the map, noting the precision of the topographical markings, the coded symbols indicating safe water sources and shelter spots. "You were preparing for something. This isn't just survival, it's reconnaissance. I told you I was waiting for the right moment." Tamsin tapped a spot on the map marked with a red X. "This is where we are now. And this," she moved her finger to another marking, about 15 miles northeast, "is what's left of Camp Whispering Pines. The main buildings are gone, torn down in the 80s. But some of the structures are still standing, including the old Counselor Lodge. Why does that matter?" "Because that's where I hid Julie's diary." Noreen's head snapped up. "You have her diary?" "I took it the morning after she died, before the police searched our cabin. Julie had been keeping it under her mattress. I knew if the camp directors found it, they'd destroy it. Too much liability, too many secrets. So I took it and hid it in a place only I knew about." Tamsin's expression was grim. "I was planning to use it to prove my innocence, to show the police that Julie had been in a relationship with someone who had a motive to hurt her. But then they decided I was the obvious suspect, and I ran before I could retrieve it. And you think it's still there? After all this time?" "The place I hid it was protected, a sealed metal box inside a wall cavity. Unless the whole building burned down or was demolished, it should still be there." Tamsin rolled up the map. "That diary is the key to everything. It has Julie's account of her relationship, probably his name, definitely evidence of his threats when she told him about the pregnancy. It's not just my word anymore. It's Julie's own testimony from beyond the grave." Noreen felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. "Then we go get it. We retrieve the diary and take it to the police. It's not that simple. The campsite is technically on national forest land now, protected area. There are no maintained trails leading to it, and the terrain is rough. It'll take the better part of a day to get there, and another day to get back." Tamsin met Noreen's eyes. "Can you make that journey? Be honest." "I won't risk both our lives if you can't." Noreen thought about her arthritis, her weakened right hand, the way her heart sometimes skipped beats when she overexerted herself. 2 days ago, the answer would have been no. But something had changed in her during these past days in the cabin. She'd discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, a stubbornness that refused to yield. "I can make it," she said. "With your help." Tamsin studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But there's something else you need to know. I've been monitoring the access roads, and yesterday I saw something concerning. A vehicle matching the description of your son's car was parked at one of the trailheads, the one closest to the old camp." Noreen's blood ran cold. "Derek's here? In the area?" "I don't know for certain it was him. But if it was, it means he hasn't left. He's waiting, maybe watching to see if you emerge from the forest. Or maybe—" Tamsin paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Maybe he knows about the diary too. Maybe that's why he brought you here specifically. Not just to get rid of you, but to find and destroy the last piece of evidence that could expose his father." The implications were staggering. How would he know about the diary? They didn't even know it existed. If Gordon confessed to Derek before he died, he might have mentioned it. Or Derek might have found references to it in his father's papers. Gordon would have known I had it. He would have wondered all these years what happened to it, whether it would ever surface. Tamsin moved to the window, scanning the tree line with the practiced ease of someone always on alert. If Derek is here looking for the same thing we are, this becomes more dangerous. He's already shown he's willing to kill to protect the secret. He won't hesitate to do it again if he finds us at the camp. Noreen's initial fear began to transform into something harder, more focused. Derek was her son, but he'd forfeited any claim to her maternal instinct when he'd abandoned her to die. If he was out here hunting for evidence to destroy, she wasn't going to let him succeed. Not this time. This time she would speak up. This time she would fight. Then we need to get to the diary first, she said firmly. When do we leave? Dawn tomorrow. It'll give us the maximum daylight hours. Tamsin began pulling supplies from the shelves, dried food, water bottles, a small camping stove. We travel light and move as quickly as you can manage. If we're lucky, we make it to the camp by early afternoon, retrieve the diary and start back before dark. We can camp overnight halfway and make it back here the next day. And if we're not lucky, then we deal with whatever comes. Tamsin's hand moved to the rifle, checking it with automatic precision. I've survived 50 years by being prepared for the worst. That's not going to change now. That night, as Noreen tried to rest before the journey ahead, she found herself thinking about the women Julie Kern could have become. A mother, perhaps. A professional, a friend, someone's wife. All those possibilities had been stolen from her in a moment of violence by a man who saw her as a problem to be eliminated. And Noreen had let it happen through her silence. She thought, too, about Tamsin, who had been little more than a child when her life was derailed by false accusations. 50 years of running, hiding, surviving on the margins of society, all because the adults around her had been too cowardly or complicit to speak the truth. And she thought about herself, about the life she'd built on the foundation of that cowardice. Her marriage to Gordon, her son Derek, the comfortable middle-class existence she'd enjoyed, all of it had been possible because she'd chosen convenience over conscience. But that woman, the one who stayed silent, who looked away, who accepted comfortable lies, that woman had been left to die in these woods. The woman who would emerge from them would be different. She had to be, because Julie and Tamsin deserved better. And somewhere beneath the layers of compromise and fear, Noreen suspected she deserved better too. She touched the walking stick that lay beside her, Gordon's initials catching the firelight. Tomorrow she would use it not as a reminder of the man she'd married, but as a tool for reaching the truth. And after that she'd decide what to do with all the broken pieces of her life. They set out just as the sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, the forest still wrapped in pre-dawn shadows. Tamsin moved with silent efficiency, her backpack loaded with supplies, the rifle slung across her shoulders. Noreen carried a smaller pack with water and the clothes Tamsin had given her, practical. Hiking pants and a jacket that had seen better days, but would keep her warm and dry. The walking stick proved invaluable almost immediately. The terrain was more treacherous than the trails Noreen had walked with Gordon years ago. No maintained paths here, just game trails and Tamsin's intimate knowledge of the landscape. They crossed streams by stepping on slick rocks, climbed steep hillsides where Noreen had to grab onto exposed roots to pull herself up, and push through thick underbrush that caught at their clothes and scratched their hands. But Noreen kept moving. Every time her legs threatened to give out, every time her lungs burned with exertion, she thought about Julie sinking beneath dark water and pushed herself forward. This was her penance and her redemption. They stopped at midday near a small creek where Tamsin refilled their water bottles using a portable filter. Noreen collapsed onto a fallen log, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. "We're making good time," Tamsin said, handing her a granola bar. "Another 3 hours and we'll reach the camp." Noreen tore open the wrapper with shaking hands and ate mechanically, too tired to taste anything. "Tell me about Julie," she said after a few minutes. "Not about how she died, but about who she was." "I barely knew her that summer." Tamsin settled onto a rock, her eyes distant with memory. "She was kind. That's what I remember most. I was the youngest counselor, awkward and uncertain, and most of the others treated me like I was invisible. But Julie noticed me. She'd make sure I wasn't left out of conversations, ask my opinion about things. When I made a mistake during an activity, she'd cover for me so I wouldn't get in trouble with the directors. She sounds like a good person. She was, but she was also scared that summer. I didn't understand why at the time. I thought maybe she was homesick or worried about college applications. Now I know she was dealing with the pregnancy, with the pressure from whoever the father was. She must have felt so alone. Tamsin's voice tightened. That's what makes me angriest. Not just that he killed her, but that he made her feel like she had no other choice but to threaten exposure. If there had been support systems in place, if she'd felt safe talking to the camp directors or her parents, maybe she'd still be alive. Noreen thought about her own silence, about how it had been part of the larger system that failed Julie, everyone protecting their own interests, their own comfort, while a 19-year-old girl drowned because she dared to demand accountability from someone with power over her. I want to show you something, Tamsin said, reaching into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a worn photograph, different from the one in the cabin. This one showed just Julie and Tamsin, arms around each other's shoulders, standing by the lake. Julie's smile was radiant, but Tamsin's expression was more guarded, almost protective. She gave this to me the day before she died, said she wanted me to have it so I'd remember that summer. I've carried it with me everywhere for 50 years. Noreen looked at the image, at Julie's young face frozen in a moment of happiness. She'd want us to do this. Get the diary. Tell the truth, I know. It's the only thing that's kept me going sometimes. Tamsin carefully returned the photograph to her pocket. Ready to move on? The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when they finally reached what remained of Camp Whispering Pines. The main clearing where the dining hall and administration building had stood was now overgrown, with saplings and wild shrubs. The dock where councillors and campers had once dived into the lake had collapsed, its boards rotting into the water. Nature was slowly reclaiming everything, erasing the evidence that people had ever gathered here, but the councillor lodge still stood, though barely. It was a small building set back from the lake, constructed of logs and stone, designed to house the staff away from the camper cabins. The roof had partially caved in on one end, and vines had grown through broken windows, but the structure remained intact enough to enter. Tamsin approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of recent visitors. "Stay behind me," she instructed, unslinging the rifle. They entered through the front door, which hung askew on broken hinges. Inside, the air smelled of mold and decay. Furniture had been left to rot. Chairs with broken legs, a sofa erupting with mouse nests, a table covered in bird droppings from nests in the exposed rafters. Graffiti covered some of the walls, evidence that occasional hikers or teenagers had found the place over the years. "This way," Tamsin said, leading Noreen to what had once been a small utility closet. The door was jammed, swollen with moisture, and it took both of them to force it open. Inside the closet, Tamsin knelt and began working at a baseboard near the floor. "I loosened this the night before I ran," she explained, wiggling the board until it came free. "There's a cavity in the wall behind it." She reached into the dark space, her arm disappearing up to the shoulder. For a moment, Noreen feared the diary would be gone, destroyed by water or insects or simple decay. Then Tamsin's face broke into something that might have been a smile. "Got it." She withdrew a metal box about the size of a thick hardcover book. It was sealed with a combination lock, the metal oxidized but intact. Tamsin's fingers worked the combination from memory, and the lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in layers of plastic bags, was a leather-bound journal with a broken clasp. Julie's diary. Tamsin lifted it out with reverent care, unwrapping the plastic. The leather was slightly mildewed, and some of the pages had stuck together, but the diary had survived. Julie's handwriting was visible on the pages, neat and rounded, the words of a young woman trying to make sense of her life. "We did it," Noreen whispered, but before Tamsin could respond, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the lodge's wooden porch. Someone else had found Camp Whispering Pines. Tamsin moved with liquid speed. shoving the diary into her jacket and raising the rifle in one smooth motion. She positioned herself at the edge of the closet doorway, using the wall for cover, and gestured for Noreen to stay back. A figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. For a moment, Noreen couldn't make out the features. Then he stepped into the shadowed interior, and her heart stopped. Derek stood there, a pistol held loosely in his right hand. He looked tired, with 2 days of stubble on his jaw and mud staining his expensive hiking boots. But his eyes were alert and cold as they swept the room and landed on the closet where Tamsin and Noreen waited. "Hello, Mother," he said, his voice carrying a tone of weary inevitability. "I was hoping you'd died out there. Would have made this so much simpler." The three of them stood frozen in a tableau that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Derek with his pistol, Tamsin with her rifle, and Noreen trapped between them, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. "Put down the gun, Derek," Noreen heard herself say, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't think so. I've come too far to walk away empty-handed now. Did you find it?" "The diary. How do you know about the diary?" Tamsin asked, her rifle still trained on Derek's center mass. "Because my father spent the last weeks of his life raving about it. Lung cancer, you know, spreads to the brain sometimes. He'd wake up screaming about a girl underwater, about a diary that could destroy everything. At first, I thought it was just the morphine talking. Then I started going through his papers more carefully." Derek's pistol never wavered. "He kept files, detailed files about that summer, about Julie Kern, about making sure certain people stayed quiet, including you, Mother. Did you know he married you specifically to keep tabs on you, to make sure you never remembered too much or said too much?" The words hit Noreen like physical blows, even though some part of her had already suspected as much. Hearing it stated so boldly by her own son made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I found his confession," Derek continued, "written in his own hand, dated a week before he died. Every detail of how he killed Julie Kern, how he pushed her under the water and held her there until she stopped struggling, how he planted evidence to frame Tamsin, how he orchestrated the whole cover-up." Derek's expression twisted with something that might have been disgust. "He wanted me to destroy it all, to protect the family name, to protect my inheritance." "So you did," Tamsin said. "You destroyed the confession." "Of course I did. And then I started doing damage control. I knew about you. Dad had kept tabs on you over the years, afraid you'd come forward someday. When I found out you'd been living in this area, so close to where it happened, I knew you were planning something. I knew you'd go after the diary eventually." He gestured toward Noreen with the pistol, "and I figured if I couldn't find the diary myself, maybe I could use her to flush you out. So I made a deal with you, didn't I, Tamsin? Told you I'd deliver my mother to the forest if you'd agree to meet with her, get her confession about what she witnessed. All I asked in return was that you let me know when you found the diary." Noreen's head swiveled to look at Tamsin, betrayal blooming cold in her chest. "You knew? This whole time you knew Derek was planning to abandon me here?" Tamsin's jaw tightened. "It wasn't like that. Derek contacted me 6 months ago through an intermediary. He said he wanted justice for Julie, that he was going to bring you to face what you'd done. I thought—" She stopped, and for the first time since Noreen had met her, Tamsin looked uncertain. "I thought he was trying to do the right thing, make his father's victim and witness finally confront each other. I didn't realize he was setting you up to die." "Neither of you can be that naive," Derek said. "I told you exactly what I was going to do. I said I was bringing her to the forest, to the place where it all started, and leaving her there to face consequences. You knew, Tamsin. You just didn't care because it gave you what you wanted. A chance at revenge on the woman who stayed silent while you lost everything." The accusation hung in the air. Noreen looked at Tamsin, searching for denial, but saw only a complicated mix of emotions crossing the other woman's weathered face. "At first, yes," Tamsin admitted quietly, "when Derek first contacted me, when he told me what he was planning. Part of me was glad. I thought you deserved to suffer the way I'd suffered, alone, afraid, abandoned. But then, she met Noreen's eyes. Then you showed up at my cabin. And you weren't what I expected. You weren't the coward who'd stayed silent. You were just another. One of Gordon's victims, manipulated and controlled for decades. And I realized that Derek wasn't bringing you here for justice. He was bringing you here to bury his father's crime forever. How touching, Derek said sarcastically. But it doesn't change anything. I need that diary, and I need both of you to disappear. You understand, don't you? I've got debts. My law practice is failing. My marriage is over. The only thing I have left is the money from Dad's estate and Mom's life insurance. But if the truth about what Dad did comes out, there will be lawsuits, investigations, maybe even criminal charges as an accessory after the fact for hiding his confession. I'll lose everything. So you'll kill us instead, Noreen said. Your own mother and a woman your father already destroyed. That's your solution? 2 elderly women lost in the wilderness. One with known health issues, the other a fugitive living off the grid. Tragic but believable. The diary disappears, the truth stays buried, and I get to keep my inheritance. Derek's face was calm, almost reasonable, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than double murder. I didn't want it to come to this, Mom. But you should have just stayed where you were. You should have drunk yourself to sleep or wandered off in the wrong direction. Instead, you found Tamsin, and now I have to clean up this mess. Noreen felt something shift inside her, some final thread of maternal instinct breaking cleanly. This man who wore her son's face was a stranger, or perhaps worse, he was his father's son in every way that mattered. You won't get away with this, she said. Someone will find the diary eventually. Someone will put the pieces together. Not if the diary burns. Derek reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a lighter, which it will, right after I deal with you two. And even if someone does find remains of it someday, it'll be too damaged to read, too contaminated to prove anything. Just more debris from an abandoned camp that burned down decades ago. Tamsin's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. You're not walking out of here with that diary. Neither are you. Derek's pistol shifted to point directly at Tamsin's head. I'm a good shot. I can put you down before you even start to squeeze that trigger. Then it's just me and Mom, and she's not going to do anything, are you, Mother? You've spent your whole life staying quiet and doing what you're told. You're not going to start fighting now. He was wrong. Noreen realized it in the same moment she acted. Years of passivity, of choosing comfort over courage, fell away like dead skin. She was done being told what to do, done being controlled by men who thought her life was worth less than their secrets. She swung the walking stick with all the strength left in her 72-year-old arms. It caught Derek across the wrist, and the pistol flew from his hand, clattering across the floor. Derek roared in pain and surprise, turning toward her, and in that moment, Tamsin moved. The rifle shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Derek stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. He hit the wall and slid down it, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "You shot me," he gasped. "You shot me." "I shot to disable, not to kill," Tamsin said, moving forward to kick the pistol away from Derek's reach. "More mercy than you or your father showed anyone. More mercy than you deserve." Noreen stood there, the walking stick still gripped in her hands, Gordon's initials pressing into her palm. She looked at her son, bleeding on the floor, and felt nothing but a strange, hollow relief. It was finally over. The silence, the lies, the carefully maintained pretense that she'd built a good life with a good man and raised a good son. All of it was done. "We need to get help," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "He needs medical attention." "And he'll get it," Tamsin said. "Right after we secure the evidence and call the authorities. He's not dying, but he's definitely not going anywhere either." She pulled out a length of rope from her pack and began binding Derek's wrists, ignoring his protests and curses. Noreen watched, still holding the walking stick, still processing what had just happened. She'd finally fought back. After 50 years of silence and submission, she'd chosen action over passivity. It should have felt more dramatic, more earth-shattering. Instead, it just felt necessary, overdue. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. They had a long night ahead of them, and a longer reckoning to come. But for the first time in decades, Noreen felt like she was walking towards something rather than running away. Tamsin worked with practiced efficiency, securing Derek to one of the lodge's support beams with rope that she'd brought in her pack. He alternated between cursing them and moaning about his shoulder, but the bleeding had slowed to a seep. The bullet had gone clean through the muscle, painful and disabling, but not life-threatening if they got him medical attention within the next few hours. "We need to move," Tamsin said, checking Derek's bonds one final time. "There's a ranger station about 8 miles north of here. If we start now, we can make it by nightfall." "What about him?" Noreen gestured to Derek, who glared at her with unconcealed hatred. "He's secure. I'll call for assistance once we're in range of a cell signal. They'll send someone to retrieve him." Tamsin shouldered her pack, the diary safely tucked inside. "But we need to get this evidence to authorities before anything else can go wrong." Derek laughed, the sound bitter and pained. "You think this ends with me? You think turning over a 50-year-old diary is going to change anything? Dad's dead. He can't be prosecuted. And you?" He focused on Tamsin with venomous intensity. "You're still a fugitive. The moment you surface with that diary, they'll arrest you for fleeing justice all those years ago." "Maybe," Tamsin acknowledged. "But Julie will finally have her truth told. Your father will be exposed for what he was, and Noreen will be free of the guilt she's carried for half a century. That's worth whatever happens to me." "Martyr complex," Derek spat. "You always were the hero of your own story, weren't you? The wronged innocent. But you know what I think? I think you did push Julie into that lake. I think my father covered for you out of kindness, and you've spent 50 years twisting the narrative to make yourself the victim." Noreen stepped forward and slapped her son across the face. The sound echoed in the ruined lodge, sharp and final. Derek's head snapped to the side, and when he looked back at her, there was genuine surprise in his eyes. "Your father was a murderer," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "He killed a 19-year-old girl to protect his reputation. He framed an innocent 16-year-old and destroyed her life. He married me not out of love but to keep me under control, to make sure I never spoke up. And he raised you to value money and status over human decency. So don't you dare talk about kindness or truth. You don't know the meaning of either word." Derek's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, and finally something that might have been recognition. For just a moment, Noreen saw a flash of the boy he'd been, before Gordon had molded him into a smaller version of himself. Then it was gone, replaced by cold calculation. "You'll regret this," he said. "Both of you." "I've regretted plenty in my life," Noreen replied. "But this won't be one of those things." She turned away from him and nodded to Tamsin. "Let's go." They left Derek in the darkening lodge and began the hike north toward the ranger station. The terrain was challenging in the fading light, and Noreen stumbled more than once, her exhaustion catching up with her. But Tamsin stayed close, offering a steady hand when needed. And together they made progress through the dense forest. As they walked, Tamsin pulled out the diary and carefully opened it, using her flashlight to illuminate the pages. "I want to know what Julie wrote," she said quietly. "I need to see it with my own eyes." Noreen moved closer, and together they read passages as they walked, Tamsin's light bobbing ahead of them on the path. The entries were dated from early June through mid-July of 1972. Julie's writing started cheerful and optimistic, excited about the summer, about the campers, about the freedom of being away from her parents' expectations. But as the weeks progressed, the tone shifted. June 28th. "G keeps finding excuses to be alone with me. Today he asked me to help inventory supplies in the storage shed. I thought it was just work, but he kissed me. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. He's so much older, so confident. He makes me feel special, like I'm the only person who matters. Is this wrong? It feels wrong, but it also feels like the most real thing I've ever experienced. Gee, Noreen whispered. Gordon! They kept reading, the entries growing more troubled. July 3rd, I told G about the pregnancy today. He didn't react the way I hoped. He said we need to handle this discreetly. He gave me money and a phone number for a clinic in the city. But I don't want to handle it that way. This is a baby, a life. How can I don't know what to do. July 8th, G is getting angry with me. He says I'm being selfish, that I don't understand what this would do to his future, his career, his reputation. But what about my future? What about our baby's future? He acts like I'm the problem, like I did this alone. It takes two people to create a life. July 12th, I've decided. I'm going to tell the camp director tomorrow. I'm going to tell my parents. G says I'll regret it, that he'll make sure I regret it, but I can't keep living with this secret. It's eating me alive. Tamsin noticed I'd been upset and asked if I was okay. I almost told her everything, but I was too scared. Maybe after I talk to the director, I'll tell her too. She's a good kid. She deserves to know that adults aren't always what they pretend to be. The final entry was dated July 13th, the day Julie died. Tonight's the bonfire. G wants to meet me after, says we need to talk privately. I'm scared, but I'm also relieved. Maybe he's finally come around. Maybe he's ready to face this together. I hope so. I really hope so. Tamsin's hands were shaking as she closed the diary. She went to meet him. She thought he wanted to reconcile. Instead, he killed her, Noreen finished. Tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She trusted him, right up until the end. They walked in silence for a while, both processing what they'd read. The diary was more than evidence. It was Julie's voice, preserved across the decades, telling a story of manipulation, fear, and ultimately betrayal. No court could ignore this. No amount of spin could explain it away. As darkness fell completely, they began to see lights in the distance, the ranger station, its windows glowing warmly against the black forest. They were close, so close to finally delivering justice for Julie Kern. But Tamsin suddenly stopped, her hand shooting out to grab Noreen's arm. Listen. Noreen froze, straining to hear what had alarmed Tamsin. At first, there was nothing but the usual forest sounds, wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl. Then she heard it, the snap of a branch, the rustle of undergrowth, the sound of someone moving through the forest behind them. He got loose, Tamsin whispered, her voice tight with tension. Derek got loose. How is that possible? You tied him securely, I don't know, but he's coming. And he's between us and the ranger station. Tamsin pulled Noreen off the trail, into the deeper shadows beneath a cluster of pine trees. We need to hide, now! They crouched in the underbrush, trying to control their breathing, trying to be absolutely silent. Noreen's heart hammered so hard, she was sure it would give them away. She clutched the walking stick, the only weapon she had, and waited. The sounds grew closer. Derek was moving methodically, searching. His voice called out through the darkness. Mom! I know you're out there. We need to talk. We can still fix this. We can still make this right. His tone was reasonable, almost pleading. But Noreen heard the undercurrent of rage beneath it, barely controlled. Derek had inherited more than his father's features. He'd inherited his capacity for violence when cornered. Just give me the diary, Derek continued, his voice moving through the trees like smoke. Give me the diary and walk away. I won't hurt you. I promise. We can forget this whole thing happened. I'll get help, get treatment, and we can move on. We're family, Mom. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Tamsin's hand found Noreen's in the darkness and squeezed. A silent message. Don't respond. Don't give away our position. But Derek was getting closer. Through the gaps in the undergrowth, Noreen could see his silhouette, illuminated by moonlight. He was holding something. Not the pistol that was still back at the lodge, but something else. Something that glinted metallically. I found a knife in the lodge, Derek called out, and there was dark amusement in his voice now. Guess the old caretaker left some tools behind. Funny how things work out. Dad killed Julie with his bare hands, held her under the water until she stopped fighting. I wonder if I have the same strength. I wonder if it runs in the family. Noreen felt Tamsin tense beside her. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, Derek would find them, or they'd have to make a run for the ranger station. Either way, a confrontation was inevitable. "I know you're close," Derek said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I can smell Mom's perfume. That lilac scent she always wears. Did you know she wore it on her wedding day? Dad used to joke that it reminded him of funerals. Appropriate, I suppose. He was within 20 feet of their hiding spot now. In moments he'd see them. Noreen looked at Tamsin, saw the other woman's face set in grim determination. Tamsin had the rifle, but in the darkness at close quarters, a knife could be just as deadly. They needed a plan. They needed an advantage. They needed... The sharp crack of a gunshot split the night air. Derek cried out and stumbled, dropping the knife. More lights appeared through the trees, powerful flashlights, multiple sources, voices calling out in authoritative tones. "This is the National Park Service. Drop your weapon. Get on the ground." Rangers emerged from the darkness surrounding Derek. He tried to run, but his injured shoulder and the shock of being shot at overwhelmed him. He collapsed to his knees, hands raised in surrender. One of the rangers approached Tamsin and Noreen's hiding spot, flashlights sweeping over them. "Are you two all right?" "We received a call about shots fired at the old campsite. Someone reported hearing a rifle discharge." Tamsin and Noreen emerged from the underbrush, and Noreen felt her legs nearly give out with relief. They'd made it. They'd survived. And now, finally, they could tell the truth. "We need to report a murder," Tamsin said, pulling the diary from her pack. "A murder that happened 50 years ago. And we have proof." The ranger station was warm and bright after the cold darkness of the forest. Noreen sat wrapped in a blanket, holding a cup of hot coffee she couldn't quite bring herself to drink. Her hands shook too badly, the adrenaline still coursing through her system, making it impossible to be still. Derek was in another room, being treated by a paramedic for his shoulder wound and the superficial injuries from his fall. He was also under arrest, though the exact charges were still being determined. The rangers had confiscated the knife and were documenting everything with methodical precision. Tamsin sat across from Noreen, speaking with 2 rangers and a county sheriff who'd been called in. Julie's diary lay on the table between them, sealed now in an evidence bag. Tamsin was explaining everything, the murder 50 years ago, her decades in hiding, Gordon Paskell's confession that Derek had destroyed, and Derek's attempt to kill both of them to protect his inheritance. The sheriff, a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes, listened intently. "This is going to require a full investigation," she said. "The original case will need to be reopened, evidence re-examined. Miss Ray, you understand that there may still be legal consequences for you. Fleeing a potential arrest. Living under false identities." "I understand," Tamsin said calmly. "I'm ready to face whatever comes. I just want Julie's story told. She deserves that." The sheriff nodded and turned to Noreen. "Mrs. Paskell, I need you to give a statement about what you witnessed in 1972 and about your son's actions over the past few days. Are you up for that right now, or would you like to rest first?" Noreen set down the coffee cup and straightened her spine. She'd been quiet for 50 years. She could afford to be uncomfortable for a few more hours if it meant finally speaking the truth. "I can do it now," she said. "I want to do it now." The statement took over an hour. Noreen recounted everything, the bonfire, the argument, the figure in the counselor's jacket. Julie's scream cut short. She described how Gordon had convinced her to stay silent, how he'd courted and married her, how she'd built a life on a foundation of buried guilt. She talked about Derek's arrival at her apartment, the drive to the forest, her abandonment. She described finding Tamsin's cabin, learning the truth about Gordon, and the confrontation at the old camp. By the time she finished, dawn was beginning to break outside the station windows. The sheriff had filled several pages with notes, and a recording device had captured every word. "Thank you, Mrs. Paskell," the sheriff said. "This is incredibly brave of you. I know it can't be easy to admit these things about your husband and son. They stopped being my husband and son the moment I learned what they really were," Noreen replied. "Gordon was a murderer who used me to maintain his cover. Derek is... She paused, searching for the right words. Derek is lost. Maybe he always was, or maybe Gordon made him that way. Either way, I can't protect him anymore. I can't stay silent anymore. The sheriff nodded with something that looked like respect. We'll need you to stay in the area for the next few days while we process everything. Is there somewhere you can go? Noreen thought about her small apartment back in the city, the place she'd called home for the past 5 years. It had never really felt like home, though, just a place to exist, to wait out the remaining years of her life in quiet isolation. The thought of returning there now, after everything that had happened, was unbearable. I don't know, she admitted. I don't really have anywhere. You can stay with me, Tamsin said. Both Noreen and the sheriff looked at her in surprise. Tamsin's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something almost gentle in her eyes. The cabin's not much, but it's shelter, and we're both going to need to stick around while this investigation plays out. Might as well stick together. It was an olive branch, extended despite everything that had happened between them, despite the complicated web of manipulation and betrayal that Derek had woven around both their lives. Noreen found herself nodding before she'd fully processed the implications. All right, she said. Thank you. The sheriff made arrangements for them to be driven back to the cabin once they'd finished with the paperwork. Derek would be transported to the county jail for holding. The diary would go to the state crime lab for authentication and preservation. And somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of justice, Julie Kern's case would be reopened. Her death would be reclassified from accident to homicide. And Gordon Paskell's name would be forever marked with the truth of what he'd done. It wasn't enough. Nothing could undo the decades of pain and loss. But it was something. It was a start. As they prepared to leave the station, Noreen looked back at the room where Derek was being held. A part of her, a small, stubborn part that remembered the boy he'd been before Gordon's influence had twisted him, wanted to say goodbye, to offer some final word of comfort or forgiveness. But she didn't, because Derek had made his choices just as she'd made hers all those years ago. And this time, Noreen was choosing to walk away from the people who'd hurt her. This time, she was choosing herself. 3 days later, Noreen stood at the edge of the lake where Julie Kern had died. The water was still and dark, reflecting the grey autumn sky. Tamsin stood beside her, both women silent in their private thoughts. The investigation was moving forward. Forensic experts had authenticated Julie's diary, confirming the ink and paper dated to the early 1970s. Handwriting analysis had verified it was Julie's. The entries about Gordon Paskell, about the pregnancy, about his threats, all of it was now official evidence in a reopened homicide investigation. Derek had been charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. His bail had been denied. His law license was being reviewed for revocation. Everything he'd tried to protect by killing Noreen had been lost anyway. But Noreen didn't feel victorious. She just felt tired and sad and strangely empty. I keep thinking about what she must have felt, Noreen said, her eyes on the water. That moment when she realized he wasn't going to let her go. When she understood that the man she'd loved was going to kill her. Terror, Tamsin said simply. And betrayal. I've thought about it too over the years. Tried to imagine her last moments. It's not a comfort, but it's a kind of witness. Someone needs to remember her suffering, or it means nothing. It meant something, Noreen said firmly. Her life meant something. Her death meant something. And now her truth means something. That has to count for something. Tamsin nodded slowly. The sheriff told me this morning that Julie's sister wants to meet us. She's flying in from Arizona next week. She wants to thank us for, Tamsin's voice caught, for giving her closure, for letting her finally know what happened to Julie. Will you meet with her? Yes, will you? Noreen thought about it. Meeting Julie's family, facing the people who'd lost her, who'd spent 50 years wondering and grieving, it terrified her. But it was part of the reckoning she'd committed to when she'd finally chosen to speak the truth. Yes, she said. I owe them that much. I owe Julie that much. They stood in silence a while longer. Then Tamsin reached into her jacket and pulled out the photograph she'd carried for 50 years. The one of her and Julie by the lake, arms around each other, frozen in a moment of friendship and innocence. I'm going to give this to her sister, Tamsin said. It should be with family. I've held on to it long enough. Noreen understood what that meant, that Tamsin was finally letting go, finally releasing the burden she'd carried across decades of exile. It was an act of trust, of hope, of choosing to believe that justice and truth mattered even when they came too late to prevent suffering. What will you do? Noreen asked. After all this is settled, where will you go? Tamsin considered the question. I don't know. For 50 years I've been running, hiding, surviving. I don't know how to just live. Stay in one place. Be a person with a name and a history that I don't have to hide. She glanced at Noreen. What about you? Will you go back to your apartment? Your old life? There's nothing to go back to, Noreen said. That life was built on lies. My marriage was a lie. My relationship with my son was, whatever it wasn't real. I don't know who I am without all of that. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Maybe we figure it out together, Tamsin suggested. Two old women who've spent too long letting other people define them. Maybe it's time we defined ourselves. The idea settled over Noreen like a warm blanket. She'd spent her entire adult life in relation to men, as Gordon's wife, Derek's mother. Even her identity as a witness to Julie's murder had been shaped by what she'd failed to do, by her silence and complicity. Who was Noreen Paskell when stripped of all those roles and failures? She didn't know, but for the first time in decades, she wanted to find out. I'd like that, she said. I'd like that very much. As they turned to walk back toward the trail that would lead them to Tamsin's cabin, Noreen took one last look at the lake. Somewhere beneath those dark waters, Julie Kern had taken her last breath. Her body had been found 3 days after her death, but the truth about what happened to her had stayed submerged for 50 years. Now it had finally surfaced. Now Julie could rest, not just in death, but in the knowledge that her story had been told, her killer named, and her short life honored by the painful pursuit of truth. Noreen touched the walking stick, Gordon's initials still carved into the handle. Soon she would get rid of it, replace it with something that belonged only to her. But for now it served as a reminder of how far she'd come. From the woman who'd accepted it at the trailhead, expecting a pleasant day with her son, to the woman who'd used it as a weapon against that same son when he'd tried to kill her. She was not the same person she'd been a week ago. She never would be again. And that, Noreen was beginning to realize, might be the greatest gift she'd ever received. 3 months later, Noreen stood in front of a newly installed memorial at the edge of what had once been Camp Whispering Pines. The bronze plaque was simple and dignified. In memory of Julie Ann Kern, 1953-1972. Her truth was silenced, but not forgotten justice. Delayed is not justice denied. Julie's sister Patricia had organized the memorial service. She stood now beside Noreen and Tamsin, tears streaming down her weathered face. About 30 people had gathered. Former campers who remembered Julie, friends from her hometown, and a handful of reporters documenting the conclusion of a 50-year-old murder case. The investigation had officially concluded 2 weeks ago. Gordon Paskell had been posthumously identified as Julie Kern's killer. His death meant he'd never face trial, never serve time, never personally answer for what he'd done. But his name had been published in newspapers across the state, his reputation destroyed, his memory permanently tainted. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. Derek's trial was scheduled for the spring. His lawyers were pushing for a plea deal, but the prosecutor was holding firm. Attempted murder carried serious consequences, even for first-time offenders. Noreen had been asked if she wanted to attend the trial, to face her son in court. She was still deciding. Patricia finished her speech about Julie, about the sister she'd lost, the niece or nephew she'd never known, the decades of wondering and grief. Then she turned to Tamsin and Noreen. I want to thank these 2 women, Patricia said, her voice breaking. They could have stayed silent. They could have let the past stay buried. But they chose truth over comfort, justice over self-protection. Because of them, Julie's story is finally complete. Because of them, I can finally lay my sister to rest, knowing what happened to her. She embraced first Tamsin, then Noreen, holding on tightly, as if they were family, rather than strangers bound together by tragedy. After the ceremony, as people dispersed and the reporters packed up their equipment, Noreen found herself alone at the memorial plaque. She traced the letters of Julie's name with her finger, thinking about the bright young woman in the photograph. The girl who'd shown kindness to an awkward younger counselor, who'd stood up to a man with power, even knowing the risk. "I'm sorry," Noreen whispered to the plaque, to Julie's memory, to the ghost that had haunted her for half a century. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up. I'm sorry I stayed silent for so long. I'm sorry I let him get away with it." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and for a moment Noreen imagined she could hear Julie's voice carried on it, not angry or accusatory, but gentle, forgiving, telling her it was all right, that she'd finally done the right thing, that it was time to let go of the guilt and move forward. Tamsin approached, her footsteps soft on the fallen leaves. "Ready to go?" Noreen nodded. They walked together. Back to Tamsin's truck, a used vehicle Tamsin had purchased now that she no longer had to hide her identity. The cabin, where Noreen had first found shelter, had been winterized, expanded slightly. It was home now for both of them. A place to heal, to figure out who they were without the weight of secrets pressing down on them. "Patricia invited us to Thanksgiving," Tamsin said, as they drove away from the memorial. "At her place in Arizona. She wants us to meet her family, share stories about Julie. Will you go?" "I think so. It feels right somehow. Being part of Julie's story in a way that honors her instead of just carrying the burden of her death." Tamsin glanced at Noreen. "Would you come with me? To Arizona? To wherever? I'm not good at this. Friendship, companionship, any of it. I've been alone so long I don't know how to be with people anymore. But I'd like to learn. And I'd like you to be part of that learning." Noreen felt warmth spread through her chest. She'd lost a son, a husband, the entire life she'd built, but she'd gained something too, the friendship of a woman who understood survival, who'd faced the worst and kept going, who'd chosen justice even when it cost her everything. "I'd like that," Noreen said. "I'd like that very much." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the forest passing by the windows in a blur of autumn colors. Noreen thought about the walking stick she'd left behind at the cabin, Gordon's initials finally carved away and replaced with her own. She thought about Derek, sitting in a jail cell, facing the consequences of his choices. She thought about Julie, finally at rest. And she thought about herself, 72 years old, starting over, learning to live authentically for the first time in decades. It was terrifying and exhausting, and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also real. It was hers. It was a life she'd chosen, rather than one that had been chosen for her. As they pulled up to the cabin, Noreen noticed something she'd planted the week before had begun to bloom. Late-season wildflowers, defiant in their refusal to yield to the approaching winter. She smiled at the sight. There was hope in those small blooms, a promise that even after the longest, darkest season, beauty and life could return. She climbed out of the truck and walked toward the cabin, toward home, toward whatever future awaited her. Behind her the forest stretched vast and indifferent, but she was no longer afraid of it. She'd survived its depths, faced its darkness, and emerged on the other side. She'd survived, and now, finally, she was learning to live.